welcome back. The topic for today is one of the records that I was most looking forward to in terms of its release so far in 2024, and that is Joe Henderson's Power to the People that was just put out by Craft Recordings. So that's what I want to get into today. I may talk a little bit about a comparison to an original pressing in terms of sonic differences and that type of thing. Before we dive in, as always, hit like, hit subscribe, hit that notification bell, and you can follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. All right, so real quick before we get into it, my third round of eBay auctions is ending tomorrow, which is Sunday the 31st, happens to be Easter. So, you know, maybe navigate over there and figure out if there's something out there that you want to bid on. My eBay handle is WCB Jazz Vinyl, or at least that's my eBay store, so it should be easy to find. And then otherwise, I've got some, I think, pretty exciting videos coming up, basically covering some of the record store day titles, so I was fortunate to get some sent to me. So I'm excited to talk about those, review them, give you my thoughts. So those are coming up. Those are all reasons to continue to subscribe to my channel or subscribe for the first time if you haven't done that. So let's talk about Joe Henderson's Power to the People again. So what is this album? Well, it was originally put out on Milestone in 1969 or 70, right? 69, I believe. So let's see, Herbie Hancock is on this, Ron Carter, Jack DeJohnette, and Mike Lawrence are joining Joe Henderson. So really fantastic lineup. And this is kind of an interesting album for Joe Henderson in terms of it representing a little bit of a pivot in his style. So I would call this Joe Henderson's first electric album. It was recorded in May of 1969, and 1969 was an interesting pivot for other musicians as well, I think, because Bitches Brew was actually recorded by Miles Davis later that year, also in 1969 in August. So there's a few months apart. However, that being said, Bitches Brew, I don't think was actually released until 1970. So there isn't this idea of one necessarily hearing from the other. I don't think, my guess is that they both recorded their albums before either album had, like they came out though after both had been already recorded. So it's not like one heard the other album and was influenced by it. It's just that this is what a lot of musicians were, this is the direction that musicians were going in 1969. So maybe I should bring up that there is some connectivity between these two albums in that Jack DeJohnette plays on both. And I guess just otherwise to kind of anchor where this album falls, In a Silent Way had already come out, which Herbie Hancock played on. So it's not like these two albums were completely in a vacuum, right? There's some connectivity in terms of musicians, and obviously musicians, I'm sure, were listening to each other and getting inspired by each other. But basically, this is kind of like that 1969 landscape, if you will. So I think that this is also an important album for Joe Henderson because of that year, 1969, and because of the title of the album and I think what it represents. Now, don't get me wrong, I was not alive during this time period and did not experience it myself. I was born in 1981. But it feels like to me that Henderson was one of the many musicians who were reacting to the time, which tangibly is a combination, I think, of peak U.S. troop involvement in Vietnam, as well as just before major withdrawals from Vietnam, I think in April and May of 1969. Let's see, this album is about a year after Martin Luther King was assassinated. At this point in time, the Black Panthers were in the press for hijacking planes. Basically, it was a tumultuous time, and I think that I think that the title "Power to the People" is kind of referencing some of that. Again, not from the standpoint of me actually experiencing it myself, but just sort of trying to read about history and infer based on that. So let's talk about this album. Well, I want to talk about the tracks as well, but just to give you a little bit closer look. So this is what the album looks like, and similar to other Craft Recordings releases, it is really like basically a carbon copy of the original. Now, my original and many originals that are out there are going to have wear. Mine unfortunately has this water damage. I remember showing this when this album was first announced to be reissued, and I said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great to not have a copy that's had all that damage?" So if there is anything that's different, it's in two things. One is the catalog number, right? So I mentioned this every single time, that really the only difference that Craft has in a lot of their releases is that catalog number. So they come up with their own rather than going with the original. Milestone one, but it doesn't really stand out. The only other thing, which makes sense that it wouldn't be on the Craft release, is on the original. I've got this. Milestone records are distributed by Audio Fidelity Enterprises, so you can kind of see that on the back. And well, it's not on this one. And guess what? It's because it's not. It's not distributed by Audio Fidelity Enterprises anymore. So I guess they decided to release that. But otherwise, this is just one of those thicker cardboard releases. It's certainly sturdier than the original, with a really nice sort of sharp gatefold seam. And yeah, as always, or as is typical, Craft did a great job with the actual packaging on this. All right, so let's talk about that music. So if there are highlights on this album, well, and I think there are, even though I like the album as a whole, I just think that the pieces are stylistically different. So if you're trying to decide whether this is something that you should pick up, or if you're just simply interested in whether you should hear the music even digitally and stream it, I would say that there are two places to start, and they are the first tracks on sides 1 and sides 2. So what does that mean? Well, side 1, the first track is Black Narcissist, which is a Joe Henderson original. And the first track on side 2 is Power to the People, the title track, also a Joe Henderson original. And in fact, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of these tracks were written by Joe Henderson, one by Ron Carter, and then a third one appears to be some type of standard that actually I'm not as familiar with. So like I said, I think that Black Narcissist and Power to the People are the places to start. And then I would also say that if there's a third highlight, it's the title, or it's the track Foresight and Afterthought, which is sort of a suite, or a combination of multiple pieces, but it's really, really good. So that is the high level, right? Go listen to those 2 tracks, and maybe I'll try to include a YouTube clip. I mean, I suppose I could send people to Spotify, but it just, I don't know, keep people on the platform, I guess. So let's talk about Black Narcissist first. The style of this thing, for me at least, it feels super moody. There is Herbie Hancock's playing electric piano here, which again, I mentioned that this is a little bit of a pivot for Henderson. He's getting more into electric music, and that is present in amplified instruments. So Herbie Hancock's playing electric piano here. Henderson plays, I would say, relatively delicate sax lines here. There's a lot of string noise that you get here from Ron Carter's upright bass. So I believe he plays both upright as well as electric bass on this album. On this particular track, it's upright. And I think it just works really, really well, where Henderson is the only sort of amplified instrument here. And like I said, there's a lot of really nice sort of string noise and detail, I think, in Ron Carter's bass that is that just kind of adds some of the moodiness, I think, to the album, to the song. And yeah, I don't know what it is about that sort of Fender Rhodes paired with straight, upright acoustic bass, but that almost contradiction, I think, works really, really well. So the second track, I'm not going to shift immediately to Power to the People, but the second track on the album is titled Afrocentric. And I would say that this track, relative to the first one, is more experimental. Henderson incorporates more funk elements to it. And in some ways, I think that this is the track that sounds the most Miles Davis-esque in terms of Miles's electric period. It feels like there's a little bit more connectivity on this one than on really any other piece, I would say, on the album. The horn line here with trumpet and sax, right? So Mike Lawrence's trumpet and Joe Henderson's sax is almost counter to the rhythm section, who are playing this repeating vamp. And yeah, I think it has a very, I don't know, introspective's not the right word, but it also is moody. It's also kind of almost space-y to some degree. And this is one of those tracks that fades out as well, which I think is a nice touch when you consider the sort of expansive quality of the music. And I know some of these terms are nebulous, but sometimes it's hard to explain what you're getting from a particular feeling on an album. Track 3 is Opus 1.5, which is that Ron Carter composed piece that I mentioned, and it's really, really nice. I would say that this is the track that is more free jazz in feel. And like I said, these pieces there's not a sameness to them. They're very, very distinct, and in some ways it feels like they're exploring electric music in different directions. a little bit. There's still so much that's like thematically that connects the album together, and it does feel cohesive, but there isn't this level of sameness across the tracks. I think when you listen to each of them, you're going to get like very different sort of sentiments out of it. All right, so let's talk about some of these other tracks just really quick. So Isotope is the next one. I think it's this is the one that probably leans a little bit more into hard bop compared to the other pieces. And so if you're somebody who likes a little bit more of that style, you know, check that one out. And I think Isotope is interesting from a melodic standpoint as well. Power to the People opens up side 2, and I would say is mostly post-bop in feel. So there's like a repeating bass and drum line with sax and trumpet taking the melody here. And like I said, I think this and Black Narcissist are the strongest ones on the album. I think this is the example of Mike Lawrence playing his best, is on this track with like a really nice solo, followed by Hancock on Fender Rhodes, which is just very spacey and introspective in feel, which are sentiments that are relatively consistent, I think, with a lot of post-bop music, and it's one of the reasons why I really like that style. Lazy Afternoon is the next one, and like I said, this is the only, well, I mentioned that there was like a standard, so this is the only standard or non-original tune on the album, although I'll call it loosely a standard. It was written for the, like, I think it was written in the 1950s as a show tune. And it sounds very different here. It's not like traditional 1950s show tune. It's almost like an interpretation for me. And then that final track that I mentioned that I really like, called Foresight and Afterthought. It's a little bit raucous. It's in 3 movements, and I would say that this is relatively free in nature. It's very moody. It's almost like soundtrack in feel in terms of allowing the listener to like imagine a scene that the music is supporting, if that makes sense. I guess that's what I mean when I say like soundtrack in feel. And I would also say that this is perhaps Henderson's most avant-garde playing on this album. And to some degree, I think that he leverages some of the sort of voicing of Pharoah Sanders. And I'll hesitate to say that because I think Pharoah Sanders hadn't really developed some of that sound except into some of his albums in the 70s. So you could argue that Pharoah Sanders might be taking a little bit from Joe Henderson, or at least that's a possibility. I guess tangibly what I mean by that is that in some instances, Henderson is overblowing the horn, where he basically puts so much air through the horn that it distorts the tone. And that's like an intentional, sort of tool that he and Pharoah Sanders used. And I really like when I hear that kind of sound, it just gives me like goosebumps. I just think it's a really, when appropriately used, I think it works really well. All right, so always the question, right, is not just what's the music like, but how does it sound from like did they do a good job with the remastering, and how does it sound? And so as I led with, I do have this original copy to compare it to, and let's be real, originals are increasingly difficult to come by, as are really everything that Joe Henderson put out on Milestone right now is just going through the roof in terms of pricing. Even Canyon Lady, which like just always was an $8 record, I've seen going for like $150 lately. So there's a lot of interest in Henderson's many albums for Milestone. He put out, I don't even know, he put out like 7 or 8 maybe, and at least one of them's live. Look it up on Discogs and you'll see what I mean. There's just a bunch of Joe Henderson albums, and to some degree I think that they are worthwhile sort of exploring, I suppose, because there's obviously a lot of energy for Henderson's Blue Note work, and I think that there's just a lot of really fantastic playing on his work for Milestone as well. So it is deserving of attention. It's just that right now some of those titles are just going through the roof. So to some degree, your only option may be to get this reissue. So it's important for us to determine, does it even sound good? So I would say that this pressing sounds really good. I didn't have any issues with any types of flaws or dropouts or anything like that on this copy. There's no noise that I could really hear. I'll say this: there was a little bit after the like in the run out after the end of the side, there was like a little bit of noise, but it wasn't that obvious, and it could just be that I need to like clean my copy. I don't think it's an issue. So on this reissue, I would say that you get more of the sound of, and this gets to like sonic detail, you get more of the sound of air being blown through the horns and the attacks. I think that the drums and bass in one channel with piano drums and bass in one channel and piano in the other, I think is a great way to keep the bass and the piano and especially the bass and the Fender Rhodes separate. And I think that that's a really good tool, because when you have those two amplified instruments separately, there's more ability to, I don't want to say play with the levels, because I'm like, I don't know that that's necessarily what they would be doing, but it feels like there's more space around them rather than being stacked on top of each other and perhaps one or the other not being as distinct. So keeping them separate really allows you to hear both amplified instruments very clearly and distinctly, and I think that that was just a good choice in terms of how they recorded it, in terms of the stereo sort of format. So the horns here, Mike Lawrence and Joe Henderson, are both in the center, and I think that this allows this ability for them to feel like they're floating on top of the rhythm section, which I think is especially useful when there are polyrhythms going on between the rhythm section and what the horns are doing. So they're not necessarily playing like the same, kind of like lockstep rhythm together. So they're sometimes going off in different directions. And so again, I think the original recording having been in this type of format with the horns in the middle, it was just like it was a good choice, I guess is what I'm getting at. So in terms of a comparison between these two albums, they're not fundamentally different from the others. So the reissue is not fundamentally different from the original. You still get a lot of the same elements in terms of space around the instruments and sonic detail. I think that this is one of those cases where there's more similar between the pressings than different, and the reissue is a great reproduction of it. This feels like a common refrain when I get on here and I talk about reissues that Kraft is doing in particular. So whereas I think some of the tone poets, there's a little bit more that's different. With Kraft's reissues, there's more that's similar, and they seem to really be representing what the original was and offering some subtle improvements. So if there is a difference on this reissue, I think that the drums, and especially the cymbals on the original, a little bit more closed off, like not as much detail compared to the reissue. It may also be, for me, that the saxophone sounds a bit better on the original in terms of the space around it and the sort of natural sound of it. But I don't know whether that's maybe that, like when the pressing doesn't sound as clean, sometimes it feels like you're hearing maybe a little bit more rasp, or I don't know, like that it just sounds like a little bit more natural of a sound. But these are like minuscule differences that aren't going to really matter, and I don't think people are going to pay much attention to. I think that the bottom line is that the reissue sounds really, really good, and it's more detailed in some areas, and I just think it's a great representation of the music. So in closing, and actually I kind of neglected to mention some of the details about this. I'll just say them right now, because I probably meant to say them up front. But so this is a Kraft Recordings release, but it's being put out in their Jazz Dispensary sub-label, and Jazz Dispensary is getting a lot of attention lately in terms of a lot of fans and like a community being built up around Jazz Dispensary. So they're calling this, they put this out in their Top Shelf series. And despite the fact that it's top shelf, it's not that expensive. You can get this for like $30. And some of the details on this particular sort of pressing is that it is all analog, lacquers cut from the original master tapes by Kevin Gray. Reading this off the hype sticker. At Coherent Audio. It's pressed on 180 gram at RTI, and it's housed in a gatefold tip-on jacket. For me, having all of that like sort of quality around the the release and still pricing it at $30 or like $29 or whatever it is, I think that this is like some of the best deal you can get these days in terms of a brand new reissue right now, because there's a lot of labels that are going up in terms of their price, and I think this is just like that right balance of like quality and amazing music and at a great price. So I was happy to be able to grab one of these copies at the full retail price, just because. Yeah, because I think it's so worth it. This is such an amazing album. I think this was like a great choice for Jazz Dispensary, perhaps my favorite choice thus far in their releases. So it's a big recommendation for me, and I continue to look forward to what Jazz Dispensary is putting out in the release calendar. Even though it's not quite as prolific, I would say, as some of the other labels. Like we'd love to have a full year's like calendar for Jazz Dispensary, but they piece it out a little bit slower. And it makes it, I guess, a little bit more special when they do have a release. So those are my thoughts on this album. It's a recommend. So that's what I think. Hopefully this is beneficial for those folks who are out there who either aren't familiar with the album or considering picking it up. That's all I want to leave you with. So again, look out for some of my upcoming reviews of some of these record store day titles. I'm really excited to dive into those, put those videos together and put them up. And go over to eBay and check out WCB Jazz Vinyl eBay store and bid on some of my auctions. All right, that's it. Talk to you later.